comes to mind when you think of classical music? Is it orchestras in grand concert halls? Really old paintings of men serving the ultimate face card in powdered wigs? Or maybe it's just flashbacks to your school music classroom squeaking your way through Twinkle Twinkle on a plastic recorder? Well, whatever it is, I think you and I both can agree on one thing, and that's for the last around 30 years, classical music hasn't exactly been popular. And that's not just an opinion, the numbers also seem to back that up, as there are reports from places like Unchained Music that put classical music right at the bottom of their genre rankings. And a Statistica graphic, albeit from 2018, that shows only about a quarter of people surveyed say they listen to classical music. So not exactly Taylor Swift levels of cultural dominance. But lately, something in the landscape feels like it's shifting. And on the other hand, pop music, the genre we all know and love, that's more recently been dominated by synths and vocals auto-tuned within an inch of their lives, with barely a peep from a real instrument, is starting to crack. And leaking through those cracks, well, the sounds of operatic vocals and live orchestras. And who are the horsemen of this pop music apocalypse, I hear you ask? Well, probably not the artists you'd expect, because it's more like the Spanish motomami Rosalía and the club classic brat mother herself, Charli XCX. Today, we're not talking about the female composers of the past, but instead the ones of the future. Welcome to Chords and Queens. So this whole sort of idea really started when I was on TikTok and doing my usual doom scrolling, and I came across this clip from Rosalia's single Berghain, and I was just instantly entranced and hooked. Not just because visually she's doing some ironing and there's around 40 musicians around her just paying her no attention at all and instead playing their little hearts out on their instruments, but the clip, once her vocals come in, it's the most hair-raising piece of new music I've heard in years. If I had to describe it, it's the perfect blend of gut-wrenching traditional classical orchestral music fused together with more pop traditional vocal effects, particularly towards the end of the song. And it had me thinking, perhaps this is just a one-track kind of thing, and the rest of the album will divert back to her more traditional pop electronic sound. But I was so wrong. Her full album Lux released on 7th of November 2025, and it absolutely floored me, and I'm sure a multitude of others, with its genre-bending classical music homaging style. I almost want to call it a concept album, as the songs are said to be inspired by the lives of female saints and mystics, including essentially the first known female composer Hildegard of Bingen, as well as Rabia al-Adawiyya, Miriam, Olga of Kiev, and a multitude of others, as well as pulling from Rosalia's own life, faith, heartbreak, and recent breakup. The album's sound was constructed with the help of the London Symphony Orchestra and conducted by Icelandic composer Daniel Bjornsson, with Rosalia herself as executive producer, treating the project more like a contemporary symphony than a pop record. Musically, it lives in a hybrid space of orchestral pop, art pop, classical, and avant pop, where thundering strings, choirs, and operatic vocals sit alongside electronic drums and more modern production techniques, which you can definitely hear on that single Berghain. Lyrically, the album revolves around the idea of lux, meaning light, and at some listening parties, I believe she framed it with phrases like, something being in complete darkness is the best way to find the light. And critics have also read the title as a nod to perhaps luxury, matching this sort of grand cinematic sound that she's captured within the album. Across the 18 tracks in the physical edition and 15 on digital, she sings in 14 languages from Spanish and Catalan to Arabic, German, Hebrew, Sicilian, and Ukrainian. Each language chosen to match a particular saint or spiritual figure, and is a process that took her 2 to 3 years and involved Rosalia drafting lyrics in Google Translate before working with translators and phoneticians, which didn't even know that was a job, but very cool, in order to get every syllable right. Guests include Björk and Yves Tumor on the lead single Berghain, as well as Caramino, Estrella Morente, and Silvia Perez Cruz, which I hope I'm saying all of those artists' names correctly. And she even collaborated with more contemporary classical artists like my favourite Caroline Shaw in different arranging roles. Structurally, the album is split into 4 movements, flowing more like contemporary classical music than the usual verse-chorus pop, with pieces that swell, collapse, and just mutate rather than sticking to any radio-friendly format. On its release, Lux was met with universal acclaim, and reviewers called it a monumental and wildly ambitious clash of classical and chaos, a real modern-day classic about female saints. And it shot to the top of Spotify's charts and breaking the record for most first-day streams by a Spanish-speaking female artist and becoming the best-reviewed album of 2025 on Metacritic, which is a huge achievement. In the end, Lux feels less like Rosalia's classical album and more like a proof of concept that classical music can fully belong in the center of pop culture. She doesn't treat the orchestras, choirs, and ancient saints as museum pieces, but instead she almost makes them loud, emotional, and memorable, and something that you can stream on a bus or blast in the club. By sort of packaging these movements and liturgical chants and operatic vocals inside a release that breaks records on Spotify and trends on social media, she quietly blows up that old divide between, quote, serious classical music and the mainstream pop world. If you're a young listener whose first experience of a full symphony orchestra is Lux rather than a school field trip to a philharmonic orchestra, for example, that's a shift in the genre's survival strategy. Classical music doesn't come back by dragging people into concert halls. It comes back when albums like Lux drag the concert halls into your playlists. And that's exactly what Rosalia has done with this album. And if you think, well, that's that, I guess it's just Rosalia single-handedly making classical cool, you would be wrong. Because while the rest of us are maybe still not over our brat summer, the brat mother herself made her own way home from the club and back to a crumbling gothic mansion where she's been working away on an entirely different sound. And yes, I'm talking about the release of her song House, written for Emerald Fennell's upcoming Wuthering Heights film featuring none other than Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi. This particular track is the first single from Charli's full companion album for the movie, and it features John Cale, who is a classically trained composer, violist, and co-founder of American rock band Velvet Underground. Sonically, critics and fans alike keep coming back and using the same words to describe the sound, including gothic, moody, elegant, and brutal. And that's pretty accurate, as the track really leans into this neoclassical dark wave and industrial rock vibe, as it's super distorted and has this really droning low end, and has strings that feel more like frightening, eerie characters than just basic accompaniment. We also have John Cale delivering a spoken word poem that hangs over the track like a ghost. I really think structurally it's closer to an art song or even a mini suite than a clean verse chorus bop, as the different sections in House creep in and out with dynamics that swell and retreat, and the vocal phrasing is way more through composed than hook driven. And that's exactly where it connects with this classical comeback moment that I keep talking about. Instead of attempting to add classical elements by just throwing in some synth strings to a pop song, House really pulls from a deeper part of classical music's toolkit and uses things like atmosphere, tension, long arcs, and the idea that harmony and texture can tell the story. And it uses all of this to rescore a massively famous novel for a new generation. It's also pretty significant that Charli isn't just doing a soundtrack song. It looks like she's composing an entire Wuthering Heights album for the film, with House as the initial calling card, which maybe puts her much closer to the role of a modern film composer than just a featured pop voice. In the same way that Rosalia's Lux drags the orchestra into the club, House drags gothic art music into the world of a very online, very pop literate fan base. So if your first taste of neoclassical drama and John Cale's legacy comes via a Charli XCX single on your release radar, that's exactly how a classical renaissance starts to feel mainstream, in my opinion. Now, as I'm recording this, the full Wuthering Heights album hasn't been released, and only another additional track called Chains of Love, which definitely feels like it's a departure from House, and maybe speaks more to Charli's earlier synth electronic music instead. Although it does feature what I think to be more of like a Bartók pizzicato, which is a classical technique, also known as snap pizzicato, which is essentially just a percussive string instrument technique where the string is pulled from the fingerboard and released to snap back and hit it. And it it makes a sort of very percussive sound, creating a loud, sharp, and percussive snap. So you could argue that there's classical techniques in Chains of Love, but I wouldn't say it's a fully classically inspired track in the way that House is. And as it's only the 2 tracks that have been released so far, I am really eager to see what the rest of the album as a whole will sound like. So I can't wait to listen to the full album when it comes out on February the 13th, 2026. So currently, as I sit here filming this in November 2025, it feels like it's a very long, long way away. So while I eagerly await the release of this album, I can spend more time listening to Rosalia's Lux, and perhaps wrapping my head around this resurgence and interest in classical music techniques within pop music. And so here I present to you my current theories. First, let's talk about why some of pop's crowning artists might suddenly be interested in a classical revival. Well, my main hypothesis is that perhaps people are getting tired of everything feeling hyper digital and over polished, and they're craving something that feels real again. Over the last few months, I've seen so much online discourse about this subject, and there's a growing distrust of anything that feels AI generated. For example, you've got stories like BBC Introducing platform getting a ton of backlash because their featured artist of the week that they had promoted on their platform, well, that artist later admitted that their vocals that they were using on the track were actually made by AI, which is quite shocking. And for a bit of background, BBC Introducing is a platform designed to support upcoming bands and artists get played on the radio. It really is an excellent incentive, but the fact that their artist of the week admitted to using AI vocals, well, what does that say to musicians and artists that have spent years honing their craft and practicing their instruments? It just highlights that if major platforms accept music by AI, do real musicians and bands even stand a chance? Since the boom of music created by AI, I'm sure many musicians, including myself, have thought, well, what is the point? Music creation is such a painstakingly long process. And here comes a website that you can type in a prompt for a song, and 30 seconds later, you can have a fully produced radio-ready hit. Meanwhile, if someone spent the last 15 years of their life learning an instrument and 5 years learning how to produce music, all that can feel so heavy when the quote-unquote musician on the bill next to them just decided to play around with an AI program for a laugh and create a track. It really is quite uncanny valley levels of deranged, and I could spend a whole podcast episode just talking about this subject alone. But personally, I think this AI slop is overwhelming people, and now folks are maybe subconsciously relieved or even surprised and delighted when they hear real instruments on a track, or know that something like the London Philharmonic Orchestra is being integrated into their headphones as it's a welcome change. I mean, I love the clip of Zane Lowe reacting to Rosalia's Berghain. It just, to me, sums up audiences' reaction to the piece. You've also got something like the dead internet theory, which is this idea that the internet has become such a wasteland of automated content that half the time it's just bots talking to other bots in the comments while we all just scroll past, kind of exhausted. And against that backdrop, it suddenly makes a lot more sense that artists like Rosalía and Charli XCX might wander over to the classical side. If audiences are burned out on quantized, auto-tuned, endlessly tweakable pop, then the sound of a real orchestra, the literal air moving through a hall, bows scraping on strings, even a singer's voice cracking just a little bit on a high note, while in this AI perfected, generated world, this feels almost radical. And we're seeing that hunger show up in other places too. Take Laufey, for example. She started out quietly playing jazz standards and lush string arrangements online, and people went wild for it. She had no giant light show, no artificial tuning, just a young woman singing old school melodies with a real cello. And now she has millions of listeners and sold out tours. And on that, if you want to know more about Laufey's takeover, I do also have a podcast episode on that, which I'll link in the description. So maybe all of this is part of why this classical comeback is hitting now. In a world where music can be generated, corrected, and polished by machines, it's the imperfection and authentic musicality that start to sound truly luxurious. See what I did there? By supporting real musicians, real orchestras, and living composers, well, this becomes a kind of tiny rebellion. Rosalía making a whole symphonic album, Charli XCX scoring a gothic film with John Cale, these aren't just aesthetic choices. Perhaps they're signals of a war against the machines. Quietly screaming within the notes, there are still humans in here, there are still stories, authenticity, and risk behind the sound. And maybe listeners are flocking to that because deep down they're afraid that if they don't, the last real instruments might get drowned out by the hum of the perfectly pitched, soulless machines. In the end though, it's tempting to frame all of this as a quirky little trend. Pop girls go classical, internet loses its mind, and on to the next micro-genre. But if you zoom out, it feels bigger than that. With Lux, Rosalía isn't just borrowing the aesthetics of classical music to sell more copies of an album, she's behaving like a modern day composer, building a 4-movement world out of choirs, saints, and symphonies, and asking millions of listeners to meet her there. And basically not caring if her audience isn't ready to listen to that, she's gonna give it to them. With House, Charli XCX doesn't just slap a string pad under a hook. She truly is leaning into gothic slow burn tension, letting harmony and atmosphere really carry the story the way an art song or a classical film score would. And add in artists like Laufey and the wider discomfort from AI everything, and a pattern maybe starts to emerge that now that the culture is starting to feel synthetic and warped, people are gravitating towards sounds that are imperfect, authentic, and so obviously human. So perhaps classical music isn't back in the way that everyone suddenly has bought season tickets to the opera yet. But it's back because its fundamental tools, like its long arcs, real instruments, choirs, drama, well, they are being smuggled into the heart of pop by women who refuse to stay in one genre. Perhaps their writing is just a reflection of the times, and that they are so tapped into the culture that they know this hyper-tuned pop is starting to sound grating, and people are longing for realness in music again, even if they don't know it yet. But if your first experience of a full orchestra is in Rosalía blasting through your headphones, or Charli XCX soundtracking a doomed love story on your release radar, well, that's what a renaissance looks like now. Perhaps it's not a return to the past, but a rewiring of the present. The concert hall maybe didn't win you back, but the pop girls are certainly trying to take you to a classical baptism, and doing so by dragging the concert hall into the club, the cinema, and your playlists. All while subtly reminding us that in a world succumbing to artificial everything, perhaps there is nothing more futuristic than hearing real humans make music together. And with that, let us take our final bow for today. I hope you enjoyed this slightly more modern episode, and if you want to discover more stories about other remarkable female composers, make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you prefer watching, you can also find us on YouTube. And if bite-sized content is more your thing, well, I post stories, music recommendations, and the latest classical music news over on Instagram and TikTok, and you can find that at Chords and Queens. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, I'll see you again soon.